This person is in a very bad state because of you, not because you intended harm, and not because you acted with cruelty, but because something in them was awakened yesterday when they felt you, and once something true is felt, it cannot be unfelt. You entered their inner world quietly. You didn't announce yourself as a force of change, yet your presence stirred what had long been dormant. They felt seen in a way that bypassed words, a recognition that reached below personality and touched the unfinished parts of their psyche. This is where the danger begins, not in love, not in attachment, but in unconscious projection. When someone feels you deeply, they often mistake that feeling as coming from you. In truth, it comes from within them. You became the mirror onto which they projected the self they have not yet integrated. You carried their hope, their longing, their suppressed potential. And now that mirror is gone or changed, and they are left staring at their own unclaimed depths. Their pain is not proof of your wrongdoing. It is evidence of an inner collapse. The structure they relied upon, illusion, fantasy, emotional dependency, has cracked. What once held them together has dissolved, and now they must confront what they avoided, their shadow, their incompleteness, their need for wholeness. Yesterday, when they felt you, created a brief sense of unity. For a moment, life felt meaningful, coherent, alive. But unity borrowed from another cannot last. When it disappears, it leaves a void that feels unbearable. That void is where they are now, confused, destabilized, and emotionally exposed. You did not break them. You revealed them. And revelation is always violent to the unprepared psyche. The mind resists transformation because transformation demands responsibility. It demands that one stop blaming the outside and begin the painful work of inner integration. If they remain in this state, it is because they are standing at a threshold. They can either regress, clinging to blame, resentment, and longing, or they can mature by reclaiming what they projected onto you, what they felt was real, but it was never yours to carry. True healing will not come from your return, your explanation, or your reassurance. It will come when they realize that the power they sensed in you was their own, waiting to be acknowledged. Until then, the suffering continues, not as punishment, but as initiation. Feeling someone deeply is often mistaken for genuine connection. Yet in many cases, it is the psyche projecting its own unmet needs, unintegrated desires, and unrealized potential onto another person. The intensity of the emotion does not arise from truly knowing the other, but from the sudden activation of something dormant within the self. The mind fills the gaps in understanding with imagination, attributing depth, meaning, and significance where little actual knowledge exists. What feels like closeness is frequently an inner drama unfolding, with the other person serving as the screen upon which this drama is displayed. When unconscious material rises to the surface, it seeks an object. The psyche cannot tolerate raw inner energy without form, so it assigns that energy to someone outside. This is why the feeling appears sudden, overwhelming, and inexplicable. The individual may say, I don't know why I feel this way, because the feeling does not originate in the present relationship, but in unresolved inner patterns shaped long before the encounter. The other person becomes symbolic rather than real, carrying qualities they may not actually possess. In this state, perception becomes distorted. The mind selects only what confirms the projection and ignores what contradicts it. Neutral actions are interpreted as meaningful signals, and silence is filled with imagined intention. The person experiencing the projection is not relating to who the other truly is, but to an internal image that feels intensely alive. This explains why the emotional bond can feel profound, even in the absence of shared history, vulnerability, or reciprocal understanding. The danger of projection lies in its fragility. Because it is built on internal fantasy rather than mutual reality, it cannot withstand inconsistency or separation. When the other person fails to embody the projected image, confusion and pain emerge. The individual feels betrayed, abandoned, or destabilized, even though no explicit promise was broken. What collapses is not a relationship, but an illusion that was unconsciously relied upon for emotional coherence. This process often reveals a deeper psychological truth. The qualities admired or longed for in the other are aspects of the self that have not yet been lived. Strength, sensitivity, depth, or purpose may be recognized externally because they remain unclaimed internally. The projection carries both desire and avoidance. desire to experience wholeness, and avoidance of the responsibility required to cultivate it within. Feeling someone deeply can therefore be less about intimacy and more about initiation. It signals that something essential is seeking expression. The intensity of the attachment reflects the intensity of what has been neglected inside. Until this realization occurs, the individual remains dependent on the other to sustain meaning, stability, and identity. Once awareness emerges, the emotional charge begins to shift inward, transforming longing into self-recognition and imagined connection into conscious understanding. Emotional collapse occurs not when life becomes cruel, but when the inner stories that once sustained a person can no longer be maintained. These stories are rarely conscious lies. They are psychological structures built to protect the self from uncertainty, pain, and responsibility. They offer coherence, identity, and hope. When these inner illusions are exposed, the psyche loses its organizing center, and what follows feels like sudden breakdown, even though the process has been unfolding silently for a long time. Illusions form as adaptive mechanisms. The mind creates narratives about who we are, what others feel, and how the future will unfold in order to reduce anxiety. These narratives provide emotional shelter. A person may believe they are valued in a certain way, needed by another, or protected by an imagined certainty. As long as these beliefs remain unchallenged, they function as emotional scaffolding. Daily life feels manageable because meaning appears stable and predictable. The exposure of illusion usually comes through disruption. A silence, a loss, a rejection, or an unexpected truth removes the external support that held the inner belief in place. What collapses is not merely a situation, but the emotional architecture built around it. The individual suddenly realizes that what they depended on was never as solid as they assumed. This realization is not gradual, it strikes as shock, because the mind resists recognizing illusion until it is no longer sustainable. When the illusion dissolves, the psyche experiences disorientation. Emotions intensify because they are no longer filtered through comforting interpretation. Fear, grief, anger, and shame surface simultaneously, overwhelming the capacity to regulate them. The person may describe feeling empty, unstable, or detached from reality. This is not weakness, it is the nervous system reacting to the loss of an internal map that once gave direction. Emotional collapse also reveals how much energy was invested in maintaining illusion. Suppressing doubt, ignoring contradiction, and defending fragile beliefs requires constant psychological effort. Once the illusion breaks, all that suppressed tension is released at once. The collapse feels disproportionate to the event that triggered it because the event merely exposed what was already fractured beneath the surface. This state is often misinterpreted as failure or pathology, yet it is a moment of psychological truth. The mind is forced to confront reality without distortion. Old defenses no longer work, and the individual stands exposed to their own unmet needs, dependency, and unresolved wounds. The pain arises not from exposure itself, but from the sudden demand to live without the comforting falsehoods that once made existence bearable. Emotional collapse, then, is not destruction but interruption. It interrupts a life organized around illusion and demands a more honest foundation. Whether this moment becomes debilitating or transformative depends on whether the individual can tolerate reality long enough to rebuild meaning from within, rather than borrowing it from imagined certainty. Pain is often attributed to external abandonment, rejection, or loss. Yet the intensity of suffering rarely corresponds to the external event itself. What truly generates pain is the activation of unintegrated parts of the self, aspects of the psyche that have been denied, neglected, or disowned. When an external relationship changes or disappears, it does not create pain from nothing, it exposes what was already fractured within. The outer event merely removes the distraction that kept inner conflict hidden. Unintegrated parts form early in life when certain emotions, needs, or traits are deemed unacceptable or unsafe. To maintain attachment and stability, the psyche learns to suppress vulnerability, anger, dependency, or desire. These parts do not vanish. They remain active beneath awareness, seeking expression and recognition. Over time, the individual constructs an identity that feels functional but incomplete, supported by external relationships that temporarily hold these disowned elements in place. When someone becomes emotionally significant, they often carry what the individual has not integrated. They become the container for safety, worth, direction, or emotional regulation. As long as the connection exists, the inner split remains manageable. The person feels whole not because they are integrated, but because the missing parts are psychologically outsourced. This creates the illusion that the other person is the source of stability and meaning. When the relationship shifts or ends, the outsourced parts return abruptly. The individual experiences overwhelming pain, not because they were abandoned, but because they are suddenly forced to encounter the very aspects of themselves they avoided. Feelings of emptiness, panic, and despair arise from the absence of internal structures that were never fully developed. The loss feels catastrophic because it exposes internal dependency rather than external deprivation. External abandonment becomes the story the mind tells to make sense of this pain. It is easier to believe that suffering was caused by another than to confront the deeper truth of inner fragmentation. Blame provides temporary relief by preserving the illusion of an intact self. Yet this narrative prevents healing because it directs attention outward instead of toward the unresolved inner terrain that demands care. The pain persists as long as the unintegrated parts remain rejected. Suppressed grief demands to be felt, denied anger seeks expression, and unmet needs insist on recognition. The psyche does not punish, it signals imbalance. Pain is the language through which these parts call for inclusion. Ignoring them intensifies suffering, while acknowledging them begins the process of restoration. Integration does not mean eliminating pain, but understanding its origin. As the individual learns to relate to their own vulnerability, insecurity, and longing with responsibility rather than avoidance, the emotional charge attached to loss diminishes. The external event loses its power because the self no longer depends on others to hold what it has reclaimed internally. Pain transforms from accusation into information, guiding the individual toward wholeness, rather than perpetuating the illusion that healing lies in another's return. You do not destroy people when you leave, speak the truth, or withdraw what was never meant to be carried for them. What you do instead is reveal the inner terrain they have long avoided. Destruction implies the removal of something solid, yet what collapses in these moments is rarely a stable self. It is a fragile construction built to keep discomfort out of awareness. When that construction fails, the resulting pain is attributed to you because it is easier to assign blame than to face the deeper reckoning taking place within. People avoid parts of themselves for survival. Certain emotions, needs, or truths once threatened belonging, safety, or identity, so they were pushed aside. Over time, avoidance becomes habit, and habit becomes personality. Life is arranged to keep these disowned parts hidden through relationships that regulate emotion, narratives that justify behavior, and expectations that promise stability. As long as these structures remain intact, the person feels functional, even confident. Your presence disrupts this arrangement, not through intention, but through resonance. You touch something unclaimed, something that has been waiting for recognition. The connection activates a sense of aliveness that feels new, even redemptive. Yet this vitality does not originate from you, it emerges from within them. When the connection shifts or ends, the vitality collapses into confusion, and what was once hidden becomes unavoidable. The pain that follows is not evidence of harm inflicted by you, but of exposure. Avoided fears surface. Unacknowledged dependency reveals itself. Long-suppressed grief demands attention. The psyche reacts as if under attack, because the defenses that once kept these elements buried are no longer effective. In this state, the mind seeks a cause, and you become the most convenient symbol of loss and disruption. To say you destroyed them is to misunderstand the nature of the collapse. You did not create their fragility, you encountered it. You did not introduce emptiness, you removed the distraction that concealed it. What feels like devastation is actually confrontation, the moment when the self can no longer look away from its own unfinished work. This revelation is deeply destabilizing because it removes illusion without immediately offering replacement. The person stands exposed to themselves without the familiar supports that once made life manageable. This liminal state is frightening, and fear demands an external enemy. Yet the true conflict is internal, between the self they have been living as and the self that has been waiting to be acknowledged. If they remain stuck in blame, the revelation hardens into resentment. If they turn inward, the same revelation becomes transformative. What was once avoided can be integrated. What was once projected can be reclaimed. The experience that felt like destruction then reveals its deeper function, not to break the person, but to invite them into a more honest relationship with themselves. Transformation begins. At the precise moment, blame loses its grip and self-responsibility takes its place. Blame is seductive because it offers immediate relief. It assigns pain to an external cause and preserves the image of an innocent self. As long as suffering can be traced to another person, circumstance, or fate, the individual is spared the discomfort of self-examination. Yet this relief is temporary, and the cost is stagnation. Blame freezes the psyche at the level of reaction, preventing growth while masquerading as justification. Self-responsibility does not mean self-condemnation. It means recognizing one's role in inner experience, even when outer events are uncontrollable. This shift is deeply unsettling because it dismantles the narratives that once protected identity. When blame dissolves, the individual can no longer rely on stories that frame them solely as victim or casualty. They must confront how their expectations, projections, avoidance, and unmet needs contributed to the intensity of their suffering. The mind resists this transition because responsibility implies agency, and agency demands change. To accept responsibility is to admit that the pain carries information, not accusation. It suggests that suffering is not merely something that happened, but something that reveals where the self has remained unconscious. This realization destabilizes the ego, which prefers certainty over truth. The ego would rather be right than whole. When blame dominates, energy is directed outward. Attention is consumed by what others did or failed to do. This outward focus creates the illusion of action while ensuring emotional paralysis. Nothing truly shifts because the source of pain is never addressed internally. Self-responsibility reverses this direction. Energy returns inward, where discomfort intensifies at first because the individual must face what was previously avoided. This inward turn exposes patterns that were invisible under blame: emotional dependency, fear of abandonment, resistance to boundaries, or reliance on external validation. These patterns are painful to acknowledge because they contradict the image of autonomy or moral clarity. Yet without acknowledging them, no genuine transformation can occur. Responsibility reveals not fault, but authorship, the recognition that one's inner life is shaped through participation, not mere circumstance. As responsibility deepens, the emotional charge attached to others begins to loosen. The need for apology, explanation, or return diminishes, not because the past is erased, but because its power is withdrawn. The individual no longer waits for the world to change in order to feel whole. Instead, they begin the slower, more difficult task of integration, reclaiming parts of the self that were outsourced to people, roles, or outcomes. Transformation is quiet at this stage. There are no dramatic resolutions, only a growing tolerance for truth. Blame collapses because it is no longer useful. Responsibility endures because it restores agency. In this shift, suffering ceases to be an enemy and becomes a guide, directing the individual toward a more conscious, grounded, and integrated way of being. Suffering in itself holds no inherent meaning. It becomes meaningful only when it forces a confrontation with the fragmented parts of the self and initiates the work of inner integration. Without this movement inward, pain remains repetitive and corrosive, circling the same wounds without resolution. The human psyche can endure extraordinary hardship, but it cannot tolerate suffering that lacks purpose or understanding. Meaning arises not from the intensity of pain, but from what pain compels the individual to see. Much of suffering persists because inner conflict is avoided rather than resolved. Parts of the self that carry fear, shame, grief, or desire are often suppressed to maintain functioning and social coherence. These disowned aspects do not disappear. They operate beneath awareness, influencing choices, reactions, and relationships. When life disrupts the structures that kept these parts hidden, suffering intensifies. The psyche demands attention, not sympathy. It signals that something essential has been excluded from conscious life. Integration begins when pain is approached as information rather than injustice. This requires a shift from asking why suffering happened to asking what it reveals. Such a shift is resisted because it removes the comfort of victimhood and demands participation. Yet without participation, suffering remains externalized and therefore meaningless. When the individual begins to listen inwardly, pain reveals the shape of what has been neglected: unmet needs, unexpressed emotions, denied truths, or abandoned potentials. As these elements surface, suffering often deepens temporarily. Integration is not soothing at first. It disrupts familiar identities and defenses. The person may feel destabilized as old narratives collapse and new understanding has not yet formed. This liminal state is where many retreat, choosing distraction or blame over engagement. If they endure this uncertainty, suffering begins to reorganize the psyche. The energy once used to suppress inner conflict becomes available for growth. Inner integration does not eliminate pain, but it changes its function. Suffering no longer feels random or persecutory. It becomes directional, pointing toward greater coherence. The individual learns to hold contradictory emotions without fragmentation, to acknowledge vulnerability without collapse, and to accept responsibility without self-rejection. What was once split off is gradually brought into relationship with the conscious self. Meaning emerges when suffering leads to this expanded capacity. The person is no longer defined by what happened to them, but by how deeply they have come to know themselves through it. Relationships shift because projections diminish. Emotional reactivity softens because internal stability increases. The pain that once demanded escape now supports awareness. When suffering does not lead to integration, it hardens into resentment, bitterness, or despair. When it does, it becomes initiation. The same experience that once threatened identity becomes the ground upon which a more unified self is built. In this way, suffering earns its meaning not by being endured, but by transforming the individual who encounters it with honesty and courage. And so the question is not whether suffering will come, but whether it will be wasted. Pain that is avoided becomes repetition. Pain that is blamed becomes bondage, but pain that is faced becomes knowledge. When you stop searching outside for what must be reclaimed within, suffering loses its power to define you. What once felt like breakdown reveals itself as a passage, and what seemed like loss becomes an invitation to wholeness. Nothing that brought you to this point was meaningless. It was shaping the only thing that truly matters, the capacity to live from an integrated self, no longer fragmented by illusion, no longer governed by fear, but grounded in conscious responsibility and inner truth.